I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. At the end of January, after nearly a year of hearings, roundtables, and white papers, the House Energy and Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Health released a draft of the much-anticipated 21st Century Cures Act. The draft, nearly 400 pages long, addresses a broad range of issues in the drug and device development and review process. We spoke to Nick Manetto, principal with the national advisory and advocacy firm FaegreBD, about the legislation, where the points of controversy lay, and whether, despite its bipartisan birth, political brawling is ahead. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Danny.
A draft of the 21st Century Cures Initiative, nearly a year in the making, was released at the end of January. This is an effort to accelerate the pace at which drugs and devices are developed and brought to market. How significantly does this have the potential of altering the way drugs and devices are regulated in the United States?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, at the core, it's not really doing anything dramatic to the FDCA and the core, processes that are in place, when it comes to a drug and device regulatory review and approval. But it does have some very important provisions, particularly in areas like rare disease, to try and continue to, accelerate and streamline the process. Really trying to take advantage of breakthroughs in scientific discovery and processes that have occurred over the years to say, look, are there better ways today to go about doing this to ideally reduce the time, reduce the cost, and reduce the risk of therapy development? So you'll see some interesting provisions around, again, trying to drive clarity on the use of, central IRBs, trying to streamline or develop a process for, biomarker qualification, and trying to be a little bit more aggressive of new and adaptive styles for review processes.
So I
recognize
that
there are tremendous challenges out there.
I know it's about 400 pages, but can you sketch in broad terms some of the highlights, what the legislation is trying to do, the framework of it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so a couple of real big pieces. One is around the area of continuing kind of building upon what I think the committee and what Congress started a couple years back in the last user fee package, but really trying to enhance the meaningful engagement of patients in the therapy development effort, so that no longer is the patient just simply a clinical trials participant, but really trying to look at things like patient-initiated guidance, patient-reported outcomes, patient preferences, benefit-risk data, and just really trying to continue to move that forward so that the patient is a more active player in the process. Like I mentioned, more regulatory reforms around general, things like guidance and biomarkers and things like surrogate endpoints. More clarity from the FDA is certainly a goal. More incentives are, there are a number of provisions, and you've probably seen that they've received a lot of attention, incentives to try and encourage therapy development, particularly in areas that have been probably under-focused over the years because of scientific or other challenges. And then there's a section that deals with sort of NIH, National Institutes of Health, and trying to, enhance areas of the NIH that are focusing on things like groundbreaking research focused on Cures Acceleration Network or the Common Fund, some language around NIH priority setting to have a better sense of where the agency is or isn't focusing its resources. And then there are a few provisions focused on access and things like coverage with evidence development and the like, so that not only do you get to ideally have more therapies being approved more quickly, but you also have them accessible to patients. So it really tries to look soup to nuts from basic laboratory research all the way through access. And there's about 100 and some odd provisions in the draft.
One of the challenges regulators face is balancing safety with patient access. How good a job does the legislation do with this, and how does it seek this balance?
Well, that's probably an interesting, that's a question you probably get a different answer depending on who you ask. I know there are some stakeholders who feel not enough is focused on the safety side, and it's too much focused on too heavily focused on incentives and, accelerating and speeding up access. So, again, I think there are more reform-oriented provisions, focused again on streamlining and modernizing, given the challenges in the rare disease and other spaces with unmet medical need and very either modest pipelines and the high costs associated with therapy development. So that's going to be one of the areas of continued focus, I think, as this develops into next iterations, seeing if the consumer and safety folks will become more in line or more happy with it, or if that'll continue to spread farther apart.
Although it does seem to take this attitude that patients with a deadly disease and no obvious choice of therapies, have a much greater risk tolerance than someone looking for a statin, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where they're trying to say, look, let's have a process or a bit more clarity around things like benefit risk, quantitative data, patient-reported outcomes, or patient preference data. There's a provision that basically tries to clarify and require companies to make more publicly accessible their compassionate use or expanded access policies. There's a lot of interest in many states these days on right to try or similar efforts. So that's, again, a recognition of the challenges in that space and a desire to at least have more clarity. It doesn't force a company to do something, but it does try and say we need a little bit more sunshine and transparency in terms of your protocols and how you will or not make these products available.
I think, and you spoke to this point, but one of the more interesting things the legislation seems to do is bring the patient in a more formal way into the whole process of drug development and regulatory review. How far does it go to actually formalize that role?
Well, much of it is driving toward additional guidance documents in this space. So it pushes on things like saying, FDA needs to have clear policies when it comes to responding to patient-generated guidance, or more clarity when it comes to what it will accept in terms of patient experience or patient preference data. I think many stakeholders want to see that firmed up further and moved up earlier in the process. The thinking is that, this is something that you can't start too late, obviously, because you need to have this collaboration, ideally at the earliest stage possible, so that you don't have a situation where you're told, well, that's not, you're shooting at the wrong target, and you find that out too late. So I think there's interest in trying to clarify and further strengthen these provisions and even speed them up in the pipeline a little bit further than they are right now.
There's certainly ongoing concerns about funding levels for not only the NIH, but the FDA as well. Does the legislation do anything to address that in a formal way?
So a couple things on that. I think that's one of the big dividing points. You have, I like to say, the two R's. You have the reform and you have the resource piece. And you typically have many on the Republican side will accentuate reforms to the process, saying we, have, it's not necessarily only a money problem, but you have a need for modernizing and enhancing your processes, whereas many on the Democratic side say it's primarily a resource problem, particularly at NIH and FDA. And that's going to be one of the ongoing, I think, questions as this moves forward. On the NIH front, there are some provisions that have that basically support increasing funding for discrete NIH functions, like the Common Fund, which was created about 10 years ago, and that is supposed to focus on big, cutting-edge, multi-institute type projects, cross-cutting projects. So there's a provision on that. There's a provision to focus on the Cures Acceleration Network, but there are no dollar amounts specifically named in the draft bill. And that's, smart politics, because once you start putting out specific dollars, then you become a target, and a lot of the questions become, well, how are you going to pay for it? And that's probably something that's another big unresolved issue that many on the other side have been pointing out. What are the mechanisms to actually pay for what you're contemplating in this package? And there have been some criticisms that the draft doesn't really do anything in that, or does too little in that area.
One of the potentially more controversial aspects of the legislation is the issue of exclusivity. To encourage the development of antibiotics, there's a provision that would provide an additional 5 years of exclusivity for a drug and make that exclusivity transferable. In another section, it would provide as much as 15 years of exclusivity for drugs that address unmet needs. The administration, in an effort to address the high cost of new drugs, has pushed to reduce exclusivity. How much do you expect this to be a point of contention as the legislation pays out?
I think it'll continue to be a big one, and it's really one of the ones that opponents seized on very early on, saying it was too heavily focused on incentives and not focused enough on other areas of importance. And this has been an ongoing. This is not a new debate to Washington. There are some ardent believers who say we wouldn't have orphan drugs today if we didn't have the Orphan Drug Act, and it's done tremendous good in terms of where we are today in terms of therapies for rare diseases that would be, untreated today if not for that law. You have others who say it's been too overblown and that we've been, essentially making this a giveaway that's not needed, and that instead we need to be focused more on, more support for earlier stage research to help advance the balls and, fail faster and the like, so that you would encourage folks to continue developing therapies. So it's a big question out there. What is the right role of additional incentives like exclusivity? And I think you're going to continue to see a lot of debate about that, especially as you noted, because there is a cost component there, and you have the balance, and you have examples like Sovaldi where you have a lot of focus on cost of these advanced treatments. And so you have to balance, obviously, on the front end, what it costs to develop and what innovator needs to see to stay in the space, versus obviously how do you make it accessible to the patient. And you have, especially when you have payers who are saying increasingly no, or trying to limit access through a variety of mechanisms. So it's a very challenging question. I don't think there are any easy answers, and it will continue to be a big topic in this larger debate.
Well, is the issue of cost addressed anywhere, and do you expect it to be addressed anywhere in the final version of the bill?
The access pieces are not really a large component of cures, so I don't really see. That would be an interesting one if they could get there, but I think the lack of easy solutions will be one real challenge there. Again, it's gotten a lot of attention, and I think, the hepatitis C drugs have really helped drive this over the past year. It's not them alone, but, you've seen sort of a pushback coming from the payer and employer community, focused on the cost of therapies, but it's been a lot of, finger pointing and blaming, and not a lot of movement toward coming up with real, workable solutions, at least not that I have seen. So it would probably be a bit ambitious to see this package take on something like that, at least in a comprehensive manner.
Well, this has been hailed as bipartisan legislation, but there does seem to be a divide in how Republicans and Democrats view the way to address fundamental problems, what you referred to a moment ago as the two R's, reform and resources. How much of a divide does this represent?
I think it's fairly substantial, but that being said, a lot of Republicans generally will support NIH and say that it is under-resourced. So I think NIH generally has a very strong fan base on the Hill, and people who get that there's a need for additional funding to support the research breakthroughs, and the NIH has sort of, we doubled them in the late 90s to early 2000s, and then there was a bump during the stimulus of the 2009, 2010 era, but then it's really been flat to declining since then. And, this has some real negative ramifications when you look at sort of these very low success rates or pay lines of the NIH and the institutes. There's a lot more good science than what's getting funded. So I think you have general agreement that NIH is a priority. And the big question, of course, is, well, where does the money come from? And this is where you get into the bigger budgetary questions, tax reform, other spending cuts, entitlement reform, all of that, which is beyond the cures focus, really is partly comes into play here. At the FDA level, I think Republicans generally do feel more strongly that we have a need for reforms at the agency to upgrade it and enhance it and make sure that we're not sort of stuck using old tools and processes when much more advanced measures are available today. So I think that'll continue to be another dividing point, more at the FDA than at the NIH.
So in terms of process, what's the path ahead, and what do you think are going to be the biggest points of controversy?
Well, I think a couple of the big points are and you've nailed them: incentives and exclusivity or broader, funding for pay-fors. How are we going to pay for these proposals? And ultimately, will it kind of go back on a bipartisan or more heavily bipartisan track? I think there is genuinely interest among many, like Congresswomen, to get in trying to go back to where this was, where it started out. And, I'm not very surprised that there have been some fractures here. When you make something concrete in legislative language, it becomes a bit more real. For 8 months, we had a lot of general happy talk around, a topic that most people agree on. We need to get cures to people more quickly. But when you start talking about process and which tactics or strategies do you use to achieve that goal, you start having obviously some divergent opinions. So getting some bipartisan support back to the table, a big question will be, I think, what does the next version look like? How does it differ or not differ from the first draft? And, how will you start addressing some of the pay-fors? Will it slim down? Will it get bigger? And then ultimately, the other big question, of course, is what happens in the Senate. They're starting a little later, but they seem to have a pretty robust commitment here. They have a working group going in the Senate Key Committee of Jurisdiction. And they have a good track record for working on a very bipartisan basis, going back to years when, Senator Kennedy was at the top of the panel. So, I think they take that seriously, and it wouldn't surprise me if they, make some real good progress in this space.
So when it all is said and done, do you think the final bill is going to look anything like what we've got now? And when do you think we'll actually have a vote?
I think there'll be elements that are in today that will probably survive, but I think there'll be a lot in today that probably will not. And I think some members have been candid about that they expect this to also tee up some issues that will come up again during the next round of user fee negotiations, which are not too far off. So, kind of float them out there today, but knowing that some of the more controversial or complicated topics just aren't quite ready for prime time, but it's a way to get the conversation going. Chairman Upton in the House has said that he wants to have a vote by Memorial Day through the full House. That's pretty ambitious. But, in the House, you can do a lot more easily given the way the simple majority and the math works. But I think it'll take more time if there's obviously a desire to get this back on a bipartisan track. So, I wouldn't be surprised if that slips a little bit. And the Senate, has made expressed no desire to try and meet the House in its timeline. They're saying they're going to work it through their process and, do what's needed to get to a bipartisan agreement. So I think it'll go a little slower over there. And, be interesting to see if something comes along, later in the year or early in the new year before everyone really starts focusing on, most heavily on 2016.
Nick Manetto, principal with the national advisory and advocacy firm FaegreBD. Nick, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Danny. Take care.
A few housekeeping notes. Over on our sister podcast, Rarecast, tune in to hear Noah Coughlin, founder of Run for Rare, discuss his 3,100-mile run across America to raise awareness for rare diseases. Then, starting February 27th, tune in to hear Chris Gibson CEO of Recursion Pharmaceuticals, discuss his company's audacious goal to develop 100 drugs to treat rare diseases in 10 years. Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.